Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar, 12 Documents Required for Exporting. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dave Noah and I am founder and president of Shipping Solutions. Since 1995, our export documentation and compliance software has helped thousands of successful exporters more efficiently generate accurate export documents and stay compliant with import-export regulations. Today I'm going to talk about something I deal with almost every day, export documents. So let's get started and start talking about export documents. As you can see, there are many different documents that may be required depending on what you're shipping, how you're shipping it, and where it's going. But in a typical export exchange, it all starts when you receive an inquiry about one or more of your products. That inquiry may include a request for a quotation. Now, if this inquiry came from a domestic prospect, you'd probably have a standard quotation form that you use. But in an international transaction, your quote would typically be provided in the form of a proforma invoice. In most cases, the proforma invoice is the first document you'll create. It acts like a quote and looks like a commercial invoice. It may be used by your international customer to open a letter of credit, apply for the proper import licenses, and determine what else they need to import your goods and make sure you get paid. A proforma invoice serves four important purposes. It serves as a negotiating tool between you and your international customer. Ideally, it will look similar to your commercial invoice. Two, while it is a voluntary document, it is the preferred method of doing business internationally. It's good form to provide a proforma invoice, whether or not it is requested. Third, it's a blueprint for the entire export transaction. When it's correctly completed, it contains several key pieces of information that can be used on many of the export forms I'll be talking about soon. And fourth, it's valid for a specific period of time. Keep in mind that material and manufacturing prices can rise, especially these days. Transportation costs can change, and currency exchange rates can fluctuate. So if you don't include an expiration date on your proforma invoice, you might end up losing money on your transaction. A proforma invoice will specify who is the buyer and seller in this transaction and include a detailed description of the goods, the harmonized system classification of those goods, their price, the terms of the sale, which would typically be expressed as one of the 11 current Incoterms, the payment terms, the delivery details, including how and where the goods will be delivered and how much that will cost, and the currency used in the quote, whether it's US dollars or some other currency. Once you've sent a prospective buyer your proforma invoice, you've set the sales process in motion. The buyer will have the option to purchase your goods, negotiate the terms, or simply decline to buy. Now, there's a couple things I'd like to mention before we move on. The first is related to the harmonized system or HS classification of your goods. I'm sure this isn't new information for you, but just as a reminder, the HS codes are defined by the World Customs Organization, and they're used by most countries of the world as the basis for classifying your goods for import and export. It's a 6-digit code that should be the same in the US as it is in your buyer's country, and it's what is used by your buyer's customs authority to determine the duty rate for your goods. The HS code defined by the World Customs Organization is used to create the 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule of the United States for imports into the US and the 10-digit Schedule B code used for exports out of the US. Now keep in mind that the HS and HTS codes can and do change. Every 5 years, the World Customs Organization releases a revised list of the HS codes, which they did in 2022, and every country must adapt them. That does not mean that most HTS and Schedule B codes were changed in 2022, but U.S. exporters and importers should make a habit to review the harmonized tariff schedule each year to see if, by chance, their product codes need to be updated. Now, the International Trade Commission of the U.S. released 10 revisions to the HTS U.S. codes in 2024, and it has already published the 2025 edition of the codes. So if your company hasn't yet confirmed the HS codes you're using for your products, I recommend making it a New Year's resolution to do so. I'm digressing here. An exporter needs to know what their current 10-digit Schedule B code is when their export is ready to file through the automated export system, and I'll talk about that a little later. All you need to know right at this moment is that a proforma invoice should include the 6-digit code for your products, because that number is going to be the same in the US as it is in the country of import. Now, I also mentioned that you should include the terms of sale on your proforma invoice. For an international transaction, that term of sale is typically expressed as one of the 11 Incoterms agreed upon by the International Chamber of Commerce that defines who is responsible for the various steps of the export-import process. This Incoterms 2020 Chart of Responsibilities and Transfer of Risk summarizes what functions the seller and the buyer, who are typically the exporter and the importer, is responsible for under each of these terms. Using Incoterms is more complicated than can be summarized in this chart, but I think it provides a good overview. And if you want to, you can download a copy of this chart for free from the Shipping Solutions website. So once the buyer and the seller have agreed upon the terms of the sale and the buyer has accepted the terms of the proforma invoice, usually by submitting a purchase order that the seller has accepted, the transaction is ready to proceed. Now, when the goods are ready to ship, the seller issues a commercial invoice. In addition to listing the amount owed by the buyer to the seller, including when and how payment must be made, the commercial invoice serves several important roles in the export process. Often, the destination country requires it before clearing the goods through customs. If there is an insurance claim on the shipment, it serves as a key supporting document. Depending on the payment term, the buyer may need to use the commercial invoice to release funds through its bank to the seller. A bank then examines it before reimbursing funds under a letter of credit or documentary collection. U.S. export regulations require that exporters retain it for 5 years from the date of shipment, and exporters can use it to support foreign credit risk insurance claims. Now, to serve all these purposes, the commercial invoice needs to include important information: the date of the sale and an invoice number, the seller's and buyer's name, address, and contact information, the ship to party's name, address, and contact information if that's different from the buyer's, a detailed description of the merchandise, including but not limited to the name of the items, their 6 digits HS number, their grade or quality, and their country of origin. In addition, the invoice should include the quantity, price per unit, and total price for each line item, the total value of the goods, any additional freight and handling fees that are included in the total price of the sale, the currency that's being used, the relevant trade term and location associated with that term, such as FCA Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA, based on Incoterms revised in 2020. A signature, the signer's title and date of signing, and additional information provided in the terms and conditions of the sale or on other documents, such as the U.S. export control numbers like an ECCN or USML classification or an EAR 99 indication, import license requirements, if that's known, any additional certifications or statements required by the buyer's country, where the title transfers from the seller to the buyer, and what the method of payment is being used. Now, there are some examples when you might not want to include the HS code on the commercial invoice. And that seems to be two primary reasons why you may want to skip adding the code to the invoice. First, your foreign customer may ask you to specify a 10 or even 12-digit number for your products. And as I mentioned before, it's the first 6-digit HS number published by the World Customs Organization that is used by most countries of the world, and that should be the same in the US as in the importer's country. But beyond those first 6 digits, it is likely that the remaining digits are different. So let's say, for example, that I export parts for an umbrella. In the United States, they are identified by the HS number 6603.20.3000. Now, if I'm exporting these items to Germany and I complete the commercial invoice using all 10 digits of that code, the German's importer paperwork may be rejected because in Germany, the correct number for that same part is 6603.20.0000. Second, your customer may ask you to use an HS code you aren't sure is accurate. So properly classifying your goods isn't always easy. You and your customer may interpret the codes differently, or perhaps they want you to use a code that will result in a lower duty rate. In either case, if you believe an HS number is incorrect, but you use it on your export paperwork anyway, you may be committing fraud and potentially putting yourself and your company at risk. In either case, it may simply be best to exclude including an HS number from your invoice. But remember, that doesn't mean you can skip including the 10-digit Schedule B code on your electronic export information filing or EEI filing through AES when that is required. Now, this commercial invoice also helps you stay compliant with U.S. export regulations. If any of the goods in your shipment require an export license or are eligible for an export license exception, you need to include the destination control statement. This statement is intended to ensure that your buyer understands that the goods in this shipment are intended for the country listed on the invoice and they shouldn't be diverted to another country. Although you only need to include this statement on the commercial invoice for those items that are controlled under the Export Administration Regulations or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, you may want to include this statement on all your export invoices. I know a lot of companies that include this statement on their domestic invoices as well. If you order a new laptop from Dell, for example, their invoice includes this statement regardless of where you reside. If your goods somehow end up in Iran, for example, having included the destination control statement on your commercial invoice is another form of proof that your company is doing its due diligence to stay compliant with U.S. export regulations. Now, some countries may require other country-specific invoices for export to their countries. For example, Canada requires a Canada Customs invoice for imports valued at more than $2,500 Canadian, unless the commercial invoice includes all the additional data elements. Also, if your buyer resides in one of the 15 Caribbean community countries, they may request that you include a CARICOM invoice with your shipment. Documenting your international shipment does not begin and end with the commercial invoice. A commercial invoice is not a substitute for a packing list, and a packing list is not a substitute for a commercial invoice. The export packing list provides the exporter, the international freight forwarder, and the ultimate consignee with information about your shipment, the packing details, and the marks and numbers noted on the outside of your boxes. Your freight forwarder uses the packing list to prepare the bills of lading for the international carrier and to prepare export clearance documents such as the electronic export information for filing through AES. It itemizes the amount and kind of merchandise contained in each individual package that is to be loaded aboard a truck, rail car, vessel, or aircraft. You'll need to refer to your packing list if you have a dispute with your carrier about the measurement and weight of the cargo. You'll need it to file a claim with the carrier or insurance company if your cargo is damaged or lost during transport. And it's used by the customs authority in the country of import to assess security and compliance. If you're getting paid for your export with a letter of credit, you'll probably need to present the packing list along with other export documents before you receive your money. A good packing list provides fairly detailed information about the merchandise. It includes the buyer and seller information, product description, a reference to the relevant commercial invoice number and or item number, the type of packages such as boxes, cartons, vials, etc., the net and gross weight of each package stated in pounds or tons and converted into a metric equivalent, except where the buyer or government regulations require otherwise. The legal measurements expressed in inches and cubic feet and converted into a metric equivalent, again, except where the government or the buyer requires otherwise. And packaging markings. Remember, a packing list is not the same as a pick list, which is a document that lists the materials to be picked up for manufacturing or shipping orders. Some countries, like China and certain Middle Eastern countries, require a certificate of origin for your shipments that identify in what country the goods originated. These certificates of origin usually need to be signed by some semi-official organization like a chamber of commerce or a country's consulate office. The certificate of origin may be required even if you've included the country of origin information on your commercial invoice. Usually a chamber of commerce will charge you a fee to stamp and sign your certificate or require you to be a member of that chamber. You'll need to deliver a completed form to the chamber office where they will review it, stamp it, and sign it. Now, a growing number of exporters are utilizing electronic certificates of origin, which we've abbreviated as ECOs. With an ECO, exporters can apply for a chamberized certificate of origin online and receive the certificate electronically or overnight by courier. This was really important when many chamber offices were closed during the height of COVID, but even after they've reopened, many companies find this service cheaper and more convenient than schlepping back and forth to the chamber offices. We have started offering ECOs through our shipping solutions software and on our website, and we've seen an amazing growth in the number of electronic certificate of origin that exporters are generating through our portal. In addition to the generic certificate of origin forms, there are also country-specific certificates of origin. The United States currently has signed 14 free trade agreements with 20 different countries in which U.S. goods are eligible for reduced or zero duty rates when imported into those countries. You'll find a list of those free trade agreements on this slides. Some of the free trade agreements, such as the USMCA and CAFTA, include more than just one country besides the U.S. To be eligible for these reduced tariff rates, in most cases, the importer must be able to verify that the goods they are importing qualify under the specific free trade agreement. Now, we don't have time today, nor do I really have the experience to begin a discussion of all the rules of origin and preference criteria under the different free trade agreements, but there are essentially three ways to qualify goods as eligible under a free trade agreement. First, they are wholly grown or produced in the U.S., like rice grown in Arkansas or hogs raised in Minnesota. Second, the goods are substantially transformed. Or third, the value of the non-originating parts in a good is less than a specific percentage of the total value of the goods. Now, this is a very simplified explanation of how goods qualify under a free trade agreement, but I hope you get the point. You can't say that a good qualifies simply because it comes from the U.S. The rules are definitely more complicated than that, and the importer must be able to prove their claim. Now, how can they do that if they don't produce the goods? They typically rely on the exporter or the producer of the goods to document that the goods do in fact qualify. In most cases, the free trade agreement doesn't have a specific form that they have to use to make the claim. A printed or electronic document on a company letterhead that includes all the required information will suffice. But that being said, most of the companies I talk to prefer to use the model templates of the forms, which typically all look very similar to the USMCA certificate of origin that I'm displaying here, to ensure that they have all the required information and make it easier for everyone, the importer, the broker, and customs, to recognize that they are making a claim under the appropriate free trade agreement. Now, the USMCA is the most common of the free trade agreements, and USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, replaced NAFTA on July 1st of 2020 and is the most commonly used form, as I mentioned. We don't have the time to go into deep discussion about the USMCA, but the important point I'd like to make, and this is accurate for all the free trade agreement certificates of origin, is that the exporters shouldn't sign the form unless they know it's accurate. I get calls all the time from exporters who just want to know what they should put down for the preference criteria so they can sign it and return the form to the importer who told them that they needed to provide it. They've got no clue if their goods qualify, and they certainly don't have any documentation to back that up. A company can face significant penalties if they get audited and can't prove that their goods do in fact qualify. That means they need to keep the information they use to make that determination. If you can't prove it, don't use the form. If you want more information about utilizing free trade agreements at your company, I suggest you download our free guide, How to Qualify for a Free Trade Agreement, from the Shipping Solutions website. Sometimes called a certificate for export or a certificate to foreign governments, a certificate of free sale is evidence that the goods, such as food items, cosmetics, biologics, or medical devices, are legally sold or distributed in the open market, freely without restriction, and approved by the regulatory authorities in the United States. For manufacturers and exporters of pharmaceuticals and food products, the customs authority in the country of import may require a certificate of free sale from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. For other types of products, they will accept a certificate of free sale issued by a Chamber of Commerce. If you're going to provide a certificate of free sale, you should check with the importer of the goods to see if they require an FDA-issued certificate. Otherwise, a chamber-issued certificate is usually faster and cheaper to obtain. Unlike a certificate of origin, you don't need to provide a certificate of free sale for every shipment. Instead, you may need to provide a certificate of free sale when you first try to import your product into a specific country. You're essentially informing the customs authority in that country, hey, this is a new thing I'm going to start importing, and here are my support documents that confirm that this product is legal to sell in the country of manufacture. To obtain a certificate of free sale, you need to supply a declaration from the manufacturer on company letterhead that the goods are manufactured in the United States. You must also submit copies of at least 2 invoices issued by your company within the past 12 months showing that you've sold these products to 2 different U.S. customers. Again, that's something we can help you with on the Shipping Solutions website if you don't need a certificate of free sale issued by the FDA. You would go through the same ECO portal that you would for a certificate of origin. Now, one of the most important partners an exporter will work with in their exports is a freight forwarder. A forwarder usually arranges the transport of the goods with a carrier and helps ensure that you've taken care of everything that needs to be done for this process to go smoothly. Depending on the terms of the sale you agreed upon with the buyer, remember that's typically one of the Incoterms that you use, The freight forwarder may be hired and working for the exporter, or in the case of a routed export transaction, be hired and working for the buyer. Regardless of who hired the forwarder, it's important that you provide them with the information they need to successfully move your goods. The shipper's letter of instruction, which is typically abbreviated as SLI, is the document usually used to facilitate that communication. I often describe the SLI as sort of a cover memo included with all the other export paperwork that you generate to tell the forwarder what they need to know about the shipment. Depending on whether or not the forwarder works for you, the SLI may also include limited power of attorney, giving them authority to act on your behalf for this shipment. In addition, depending on who hired the forwarder, the SLI may grant them permission to file the export information electronically through the automated export system, also known as AES. Most exports valued at more than $2,500 per item must be submitted to customs via AES. Now, that's a very broad explanation of the AES filing requirements, but the point I want to make here is that filing through AES is an important consideration for many exporters. Now, if the freight forwarder is hired by the buyer, then it's the forwarder acting as an agent for the buyer who typically does the AES filing. Even if you, as the seller, is the one who hires the forwarder, you may pay them to do the AES filing on your behalf. In either case, even if you aren't doing the AES filing yourself, you are legally required to provide certain data elements to the forwarder so the filing can be done. And the SLI document is what you use to do that. Now, as an aside, I strongly believe that exporters should almost always be the party that does the AES filing, even in a routed export transaction where the buyer picks the forwarder, and you can negotiate with the buyer to give you permission to do so. Filing through AES is not that hard to do, and it gives you more control over the process. More and more of our clients are assuming that responsibility for every export shipment for just that reason. However, I do understand that many companies rely on a freight forwarder for their AES filings, so an accurately completed SLI is very important. Now, I've updated this presentation this year. If you've attended it in the past, it used to be called 11 documents required for exporting. I've updated it to 12 documents, and that's because of the Bureau of Industry and Security's emphasis on asking exporters to have their customers sign an end-use or end-user certificate as part of their export compliance procedures. In addition to affirming that the intended end-use and end-user of the goods or who they are and what they're going to use it for, the certificate may also include applicable legal requirements that apply to the goods, such as stating that they are subject to the Export Administration regulations and they may not be diverted to a prohibited end user, end use, or destination. In some cases, an end user certificate is required by the Bureau of Industry and Security or the Directorate of Defense Trade Control, DDTC. In other cases, companies use it as a standard part of their due diligence process for all their exports, even when it's not required by the regulations. Or a company may require it in certain circumstances, such as when they're exporting to a higher risk regions of the world, or when they have other potential concerns about a customer. End use and end user certificates can play a critical role in safeguarding national security, ensuring your organization's regulatory compliance, and promoting responsible international trade practices. So at this point, I've talked about what I think are the 7 most common forms that an exporter will produce: the proforma invoice, the commercial invoice, the packing list, a certificate of origin, a certificate of free sale, a shipper's letter of instruction, and an end user certificate. But remember, that's just typical. There may be other documents you need depending on what, where, and how you're exporting, and how much or how little of the responsibility you want to take on. So one of the other documents you may need is an inland bill of lading, and it's often the first transportation document created for an export. It can be prepared by the inland carrier, or you can create it yourself. It's a contract of carriage between the shipper of the goods that states where the goods are going. It also serves as your receipt that the goods have been picked up. In an international shipment, the inland bill of lading is not typically consigned to the buyer. Instead, it's consigned to the carrier, who will be moving the goods internationally, or if not directly to the carrier, to a forwarder, a warehouse, or some other third party who will consign your goods to the carrier when it's ready. It's important to correctly fill out a bill of lading because it determines the shipment date. And the payment date, the date you get paid, is often associated with the shipment date. Financing too is often associated with the shipment date, as banks often prefer to pre-shipment financing and post-shipment financing. Also keep in mind that more than 10,000 shipping containers get lost every year, so you'll need a correctly completed bill of lading to help make a claim with the carrier or insurance company. Now, if your goods are shipping by ocean vessel, you'll need an ocean bill of lading. An ocean bill of lading can serve as both a contract of carriage and a document of title for the cargo. A straight bill of lading is consigned to a specific consignee and is not negotiable. The consignee can take possession of the goods by presenting a signed original bill of lading to the carrier. A negotiable bill of lading is consigned to order or to order of shipper and is signed on the back by the shipper and sent to the bank in the buyer's country. The bank holds on to the original bill of lading until the requirements of a documentary collection or a letter of credit have been satisfied. Agricultural commodities such as soybeans, for example, can be bought and sold during its journey across the ocean, and a negotiable bill of lading helps with that process. If your goods are being shipped on a plane, then an airway bill is required. Unlike an ocean bill of lading, an airway bill can never be negotiable. Instead, it's a contract of carriage between the shipper and the carrier. Now, if your products are considered dangerous goods by either the International Air Transport Association, abbreviated as IATA, or the International Maritime Organization, abbreviated as IMO, you need to include the appropriate dangerous goods form with your shipment. Shipping dangerous goods or hazardous materials can be tricky, and before you do that, the appropriate people at your company need to be trained in the proper packaging, labeling, and documentation of these shipments. The document you see here on the screen with the red border is the IATA form, the shipper's declaration for dangerous goods, and it's required for air shipments. There is a different version of the form. You'll often see it with blue borders, although those blue borders aren't actually a legal requirement, for ocean shipments. Again, these forms need to be completed by someone who has been specially trained for dangerous goods shipping. During my discussion of the negotiable ocean bill of lading, I mentioned documentary collections and letters of credit. What you see here is a bank draft that may be used to collect payment for exports under those terms. It serves as a guarantee of payment to the recipient, who is typically the exporter, by the issuing bank. In a letter of credit arrangement, the importer's bank issues a letter of credit to the exporter, guaranteeing payment upon the presentation of specified documents and compliance with the terms and conditions of the credit. The letter of credit may specify the use of a bank draft as the method of payment. The exporter is required to draft a document that instructs the paying bank to make payment to the exporter or a nominated party. This bank draft is then presented along with other required documents to the bank specified in a letter of credit. Documentary collections involve the exporter shipping the goods and presenting the shipping documents to the bank. The exporter's bank forwards these documents to the importer's bank with instructions for payment. Now, similar to a letter of credit, the exporter may use a bank draft as part of the documentary collection process. The bank draft becomes a payment order, instructing the importer or the importer's bank to make payments to the exporter upon fulfillment of certain conditions. The bank draft may or may not include a transmittal letter, which includes details of the draft transaction, including the types of additional documents that are included and payment instructions. In both scenarios, whether through a letter of credit or documentary collections, the use of a bank draft provides a level of assurance to the exporter. The bank draft serves as a payment guarantee, backed by the issuing bank's commitment to honor the draft upon compliance with specific terms and conditions. Now, I've tried to give you a basic understanding of the typical documents you might need to create for your export shipments. I often get asked by exporters, particularly new exporters or those companies that are looking to expand their exports to new markets, how they know what documents they need to produce. And I usually tell them to ask. If you're going to get this right, if you're going to make sure your goods clear customs at both borders, arrive in a timely manner, and that you get paid in full, you can't start thinking about paperwork only once your goods are ready to ship. When you are talking to a prospective customer in a foreign country, your discussion should include which export forms are required and who's going to prepare them. If you don't understand what they're looking for, ask. If what they're looking for doesn't make sense to you, don't be afraid to push back until you are satisfied. I have talked to so many companies where people request certain documents and it's only because that's what they've always done. They have no legal basis for that request. So don't be afraid to ask for documented proof that they need a particular document. Talk to your freight forwarder and your bank to find out what documents they think you'll need for your shipment. Your freight forwarder and your banker are your partners in this enterprise, and they will almost certainly be very forthcoming with advice and assistance. If they aren't helpful, then you should find someone else to work with. Once you've determined what documents you need, make sure you fill them out completely and accurately. It's important that your information is consistent across all your documents. A wrong address on a form could slow a shipment. A discrepancy in how you describe a product may cause a problem at a bank. And I shouldn't have to say this, but accuracy includes honesty. I've heard too many examples of companies that have changed the HS classification of their goods on their paperwork at the request of the buyer who is trying to reduce the amount of duty they must pay upon import. Or the buyer will ask the exporter to lower the price of the goods on the export invoice or to mark it as a shipment of samples with no value to save them money. Now, these requests may sound harmless, but they are fraud and they can get the export company, and most importantly, the person who signed these fraudulent documents, in a lot of trouble. Not only could you be fined for these activities, in extreme cases, you could lose your export privileges and even end up in jail. Now, the last thing I want to touch on in this discussion of export documents is document retention. And when I talk about export documents, I'm not just talking about the export forms you include with your shipment and that I've discussed today. The regulations say you must also maintain any correspondence, emails, notes from phone calls, and other such things that are part of the export transaction. Part 772 of the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, has a comprehensive list of what you must keep. You should look at that list if you haven't already. As a general rule, export regulations require you to maintain export documents for at least 5 years after an export transaction is complete. Now, 5 years is the standard for most agencies that have a hand in exporting, including the Bureau of Industry and Security, U.S. Census Bureau, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, and other agencies. In September 2024, however, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls released an interim final rule that expands its record-keeping requirements to 10 years, which aligns with changes they're making that double the statute of limitations for OFAC sanctions program violations from 5 to 10 years. This new requirement applies to exports to prohibited parties, even if exemptions and general licenses are available that don't require the exporter to apply for a specific license. This new final rule goes into effect on March 12th of 2025. Now, while at the time of this webinar, other agencies haven't announced their intention to increase their document retention requirements from 5 to 10 years, but keep in mind that OFAC regulations can be broad and they may impact your exports even if your goods fall under the jurisdiction of BIS or DDTC. Also keep in mind that different federal agencies and departments start the clock on record retention at different points in time. Certain sets of regulations state you must maintain your documents for 5 years from the date of export. Others say 5 years after the export is complete. And still others say you must maintain the documents for 5 years after an export license has expired. It's your job to know what these caveats are and make sure you abide by them. Even once those 5 or 10 years are up, you still may not be able to toss the records. If a government agency requests information pertaining to a particular export shipment before the 5-year period is up, you must continue to keep all the records related to that shipment until you have written authorization to destroy them. All the information I've talked about today can be found in one or more of the hundreds of articles that we published on my company's free international trade blog, which we call Passages. If you go to shippingsolutions.com/blog, you'll find all the articles organized by topic. All these blog posts go into greater detail than I can do in a 1-hour webinar today. Since all of us have different learning styles, we also have a Shipping Solutions YouTube channel where we publish the same type of information. If you learn better by listening and watching rather than reading, check out our YouTube channel, and if you like it, please subscribe to it. In addition to all the who, what, and why information we provide on our website, you can also download free PDF templates of all the export forms I've mentioned today, and I believe Kari has put links into the chat where you can go and do that. If you go to shippingsolutions.com, click on the resources link at the top of the page, and then the download export forms menu item. Now, we've also created a resources page on our website that includes the links that we mentioned during today's webinar and that Kari has posted in the chat. And also, we've added links to register for upcoming events and to sign up for our Passages twice weekly email newsletter. The URL for that is listed on this slide. You can also use your phone and take a picture of the QR code, and that will take you to that page as well. So thanks again for joining us, and I will go through now and answer questions as we have time left to do so. First question was, do we need to mention when the goods will be shipped from? Typically, you want to make sure you include the date of the shipment as well as where they will be shipping from, if it's different from the exporter's address. Someone asked, is this requirement different for USMCA countries? I'm afraid I don't remember in what context you're asking that question. If you want to ask that again. Do the certificates of origin expire? A certificate of origin typically that is stamped by a Chamber of Commerce would typically be for one particular shipment, so it would expire after that. A certificate of free sale does not expire typically unless the product changes. And a certificate of origin for a free trade agreement, it can either be done for a single shipment, or often a company will do a blanket certificate of origin under a free trade agreement that's good for up to 1 year. So that would be good for a year. What price should you list on the commercial invoice for the goods that you're shipping? Is it the cost of the goods, i.e. the price the shipper purchased the items? Part of it is going to be dependent on the trade term you use. You may want to break out the cost of freight and handling in the invoice. That if that was the agreement between the buyer and seller, that the seller was going to handle the shipping, they may want to break it out. And the reason they may want to break it out, there may be certain fees that they can exclude from the price of the goods when they're clearing the goods through customs in the country of import. So again, it depends on the Incoterm you're using. How can the exporter determine if product is made in the USA or other country? Well, I touched on that a little bit. There are different rules depending on how you're doing that determination. A free trade agreement rules of origin are typically more specific and may have higher levels for making that determination. So it depends on what case you're doing that. We do have a webinar that we have hosted on determining the country of origin, and ask Kari to maybe post a link to that in the chat, and you could watch that webinar. Again, it depends on under what circumstance that is, and it can be quite involved. And so I would suggest you watch that webinar for more information, or download if it's related to a free trade agreement, download the white paper we have published on that topic. Problem, for example, ordering nuts and bolts from McMaster Car. McMaster Car is unable to certify country of origin as they get them from many countries. How to handle a certificate of origin for export to our manufacturing plant in Juarez. Well, if that is under a free trade, if the USMCA certificate of origin, then you may not be able to qualify under the USMCA unless you can document where the goods are originating, and that may be a discussion you want to have with the producer of the goods so that they do a better job of keeping track of where parts come from. And of course, if they represent a small part of the total value of the items, it may not be relevant, but there are a lot of considerations there that you should go through that I don't have time to explain here. But if you want to send me an email directly, I'd be happy to provide you some more information about that. Isn't the AAS filing based on the value of HTS if the value is US dollars, $2,500 more? Yes, if I misspoke, I'm sorry. It is per HTS code, per Schedule B code. The regulations use the Schedule B code. So it's $25. So if you have multiple line items on your shipment that all have the same Schedule B code, they all have the same domestic or foreign designation, they all have the same export license classification, you need to combine those together, and if the value of those combined together is more than $2,500, then you need to file through AES with certain other exemptions. Shipments to Canada don't typically need to do an AES filing. Which documents are required for a letter of credit? That's a great question to ask your bank. That would be something you'd want to work through with them. Which documents are required for the Ex-Im Bank? Again, I talked to them. We did a webinar last month with a representative from the Ex-Im Bank. If you haven't watched that, I would recommend that you do that. But I would talk to a representative of the Ex-Im Bank for more information about that. Save documents for 5 or 7 years. Again, typically most requirements are that you must save the documents for at least 5 years, although the point at which the clock starts tipping can be different depending on which set of regulations you're using. I did also mention that under the OFAC regulations, the new proposed rule, that you will need to save the documents for 10 years. So keep that in mind. Where do we find the comprehensive list of which documents need to be saved again? Apologies, I did not save that. That is part 744 of the Export Administration Regulations. I think I'm going to ask Kari to post a link to our blog post, if she can do that before we run out of time here, where we have that article on that topic, and that's got a direct link to those regulations and a more comprehensive list than I talked about today. What happens if the exporter did make a mistake of classification of an HS code? How do you correct it? Are there any consequences? Well, there could be consequences if it's not, if it's wrong and the classification has not been corrected. The importer may not be able to clear the goods through customs, or they may go after the importer and have them pay back duties and interest and other penalties. So you do want to correct that as soon as you know something was wrong. Who provides authorization for destruction of paperwork? Well, I would check the individual regulations depending on if your goods are subject to the Export Administration Regulations or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations for the specific time frame of when you can destroy the documents. I don't think you need to. For the authorization. Okay, I understand the question. If your shipment is being reviewed by an authority, whether it's BIS or DDTC, I don't actually know who in particular that would be that provides that authorization. Although it would be someone from that agency, I would assume. I don't know exactly that answer. Will it be really bad to send extra paperwork for orders if we don't know exactly what is needed or not? I would ask your freight forwarder that question. I would rather send too much paperwork than not enough, although it might cause confusion among the forwarder or the carrier or the importer if there's extra paperwork. I talked to one client of ours who was including the USMCA for every export shipment, regardless of the destination country. So I think that would typically have just been thrown away. But if someone used that as authorization to claim special tariff rates because that's supplied, then it might get both the importer and the exporter in trouble. So I would try to work with your forwarder, the carrier, and your customer to find out which documents you do need to provide. Does the shipping company assign the harmonized system codes and Schedule B codes? Typically, the company who knows how the item is created, what it does, what capabilities it has, person who best knows the product should be assigning the number. For complicated products, the process of properly classifying your items should probably involve your engineering department to help with you to understand and make sure which correct code is appropriate for your products. What to do if the export shipment is stuck in customs in the foreign country? That's beyond my knowledge. First thing I would do is contact my forwarder to see what we need to do and the customer. But I think there are better resources than me to try to find the answer to that. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll wrap this up. Tracy posted a comment that my question wasn't answered. He sidestepped it. I did not intend to sidestep it. Tracy, please send me an email and I will try to provide a more detailed, accurate answer to your question. My email address is david.noah, Noah, at intermart, intermart-inc.com. Tracy or anyone else who wants to ask me a follow-up questions, please do that. Last question. You mentioned to skip the HS number. Would it be okay to include the 6 digits instead of none, just to ensure the overseas agent uses the correct description of the product. Certainly, I would say in most cases I would include the 6-digit number on my invoices. There just may be, if the buyer and the seller disagree what those 6 digits are, then that may be one case where you don't want to include any HS number on the invoices. Or if they ask you, are very adamant that you go beyond the 6 digits, that may be another one where I skip it. But typically, yes, 6 digits would be what I would want to include. So thank you for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out an email in the next few days with a link to the recording. I hope you found this helpful, and I thank you all for joining me today. Take care. Bye-bye.